In the last video, we discussed the first canto of Dante's Divine Comedy, that rather famous introduction to Dante's life in the midst of things, right? As we talked about, the first line being one of the more carefully constructed lines of literature that I can think of off the top of my head. Midway through life's journey, we are caught up into Dante's life. There's references to Isaiah, there's references to Aristotle's works, there's references to Roman literature all throughout. And we are brought up, seeing the glimpses of this mount of happiness, this mount of blessedness. But alas, Dante is stopped and given Virgil. And I'm emphasized that it's Virgil being given that is an important facet of that first poem. Virgil does not simply stumble across Dante, but he is given as a gift. And in the second canto, we see where that gift actually comes from. It originates from heaven. So, Canto 2 picks up with Dante realizing his own cowardice. He talks about him unwilling the thing that he willed. As I've already insinuated a few times, the will for Dante is perhaps the most important theological and philosophical concept that he's going to try to tackle as an author. What do we do with human will? What do we do with divine will? Where do the two intersect? Where do they meet? And how is our will brought into the divine wills? How are the two unified? That's a big question he wants to ask. And indeed, it's the center three cantos of Purgatorio and the center three cantos of the entire work that are going to try to answer that question in the most philosophically robust way. In the most philosophically robust way that Dante can as a poet. But it's the rest of it that he really tries to get the reader in on this question. What is the issue of the will? And here already we see that happening. Dante first willed to go up the hill, and now suddenly he's convincing himself out of it until he wills what he didn't will before. Right? There's a little bit of play on words that the Chiardi translation does there with will and will. Now, what Virgil does is interesting. We might think that he would merely tell Dante that the journey is worthwhile, or that he should do it, or to bucko up, or something like that. He doesn't do anything like that. Instead, he says, Dante, why don't I tell you who sent me? And we get this little backstory, this prologue that what was happening before we ran into Virgil in Canto 1. And Dante tells us that Dante tells us through Virgil that first Mary was moved to turn to Saint Lucy. Lucy was moved to turn to Beatrice. And Beatrice, sitting next to Rachel, was moved to descend all the way into hell, find Virgil, and move Virgil to Dante. This could sound like a rather odd chain of command, especially if you're not thinking through these things in the way that Dante is expecting you to naturally. After all, he's writing to a specific audience who are going to understand these figures in certain ways that might be foreign to you. And it also might be odd if you're just thinking of these figures as the figures themselves. If you're thinking of Beatrice as this woman that Dante encountered, if you're thinking of Virgil as the poet, and if you're thinking of these great saints just simply as the figures that they historically and biblically represent. They're doing more here. Now, first off, we should recognize an important theme, which is that some people have pointed to the lack of Christ presence in the Divine Comedy as a strike against Dante. Now, certainly Jesus does show up in the Divine Comedy. He shows up towards the end at the very top of Mount Purgatory. He shows up at a couple of other places in Paradiso. His name is never mentioned in hell, but he is talked about several instances as the harrower of hell. But he's not directly referenced there. And so some people take it this way and they say, Dante talks a lot more about some of these saints. He talks a lot more about some of these pagans than he does Jesus. Well, keep in mind that for Dante, to be in paradise is to have your will fully united and aligned with God's will. So whatever it is that the saints in heaven will, so too we can understand that God has first been the prime cause, the love that moves the stars, as we'll, of course, end up seeing that grand portrayal in the conclusion of the poem. Now, you could critique Dante for this, but I think that it's worth at least recognizing that that's what he's doing. He's showing you the love of God through creation, and especially through the lives of the saints. The prime one that's going to move first is going to be that of Mary. And Mary here is representative of faith. She's representative of the first moment of faith, and we're going to see her especially show up throughout Purgatorio as this archetype of faith. After that, she turns to St. Lucy. Remember St. Lucy, or as it's put in the copy that we have, St. Lucia, or Lucia, is going to be an interesting figure. We don't know that much historically about her. We believe that she was martyred sometime in the 300s. It's possible that she gouged her own eyes out of worry for her own immodesty, but not immodesty, but her own frailty, in reference to Christ's commands to gouge out your eye if it causes you to stumble. But it's more likely that she was actually probably tortured while she was being killed and martyred for Christ, and part of that included gouging her eyes out. And so there's been a recognition historically that there's kind of an interesting play with her name meaning light and the fact that she is without sight, at least in the moments of her death. And so she becomes this patron saint of sight and seeing and light. And indeed, we can also recognize that if Mary is going to symbolize faith, St. Lucy here is going to symbolize something like hope. An unfulfilled will, but a will that is moving towards fulfillment. And that's somewhat how Aquinas would define hope. Remember that hope is an imperfect will, just as faith is an imperfect intellect. That means, and unsurprisingly, that Beatrice is going to be representative of divine love. We've already talked about how she's reflective of the beatific vision, this idea of Sehnsucht, this holy longing that C.S. Lewis is going to latch onto largely because of Beatrice. And we've done so especially by looking at books like the first instance where we see Beatrice come into Dante's life, La Vita Nuovo. And that is clear that Dante does not just think of her as a historical person, though she certainly was a historical person. If you think of her merely as this figure that Dante ran into a couple of times in his life, 3 times in his life, you're probably not thinking of Dante enough like a poet. And it's usually in those instances that people begin to think, Dante, that's a little creepy. Indeed it is, if you're only thinking of her as this woman. But keep in mind, her very name is reflective of the beatific vision, of beatitude that we saw when we were going through Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy, the blessedness and the happiness of the good life. So it would be a mistake simply to read her as just a woman in the sense of just any ordinary woman that Dante has a particular infatuation with. Instead, you should remember that she is this really divine love that's coming and condescending to meet Dante. Now, what's interesting is that she doesn't go all the way to Dante, right? She seems forbidden. She seems stopped just at the gates of hell, which is surprising because that's pretty close, actually, comparatively to all the distance that we'll travel. We'll get to the gates of hell in just a moment. We'll get to where Virgil is at, actually, just beyond the gates of hell, in just a few cantos. And she meets Virgil there, and Virgil is going to be representative of human intellect. Virgil is representative of the synthesis of the poets and the philosophers for Dante. And this is important to keep in mind throughout the journeys. Every now and then we come across Virgil's shortcomings. This is going to be especially true when we get to the end of Purgatorio. Virgil is no longer able, really through much of Purgatorio, but even especially towards the end, he's no longer really able to see the things that Dante, a person with charity on his heart, is able to see. And so we will eventually see the shortcoming of human reason. But it's notable that Beatrice, through the movement of the Holy Spirit and the ultimate movement of God himself, gives Dante the gift of human reason to bring him up through the what will first be a descent, but then eventually ascent into heaven. Keep all of these things in mind. Dante wants you to pay attention. And indeed, these are not insignificant ideas. So as we move forward, don't forget what some of these figures represent. Now, similar to Lady Philosophy and Consolation of Philosophy, it's not always a one-to-one. Sometimes it's more obvious that Beatrice is representative of the woman that Dante knew in his life, at least on a few instances. Sometimes it's very clear that she's divine love. Sometimes it's also very clear that she's something kind of different altogether. We'll do the same with the Son. The Son will be representative of divine illumination, especially in these first few cantos, and then through a lot of Purgatorio. But then we'll end up going to the sun, and we'll see that there's saints dancing around it, including none other than St. Thomas Aquinas and St. Francis of Assisi and others like him, like them, I should say. So keep in mind that just because something is representative of something else, just because it's a type and a figure, doesn't mean it's going to be static for Dante. But it's still a good rule of thumb. It's still a good default setting to have for a lot of these characters. All right, this is a lot of ground laying. We are about to now enter into really the content of the poem, the content of the comedy. And so with all of that aside, I'll leave it to the next video to get to that.